session, extending regulation to urban on-site sanitation initiatives from ESAWAS countries. So this is convened by NOASCO, Water and Sanitation Regulator in Zambia, by ESAWAS, and more of them in just a moment, and by Water and Sanitation for the Urban Poor. So we have a lot of content to move through today, so the context for this session is going to be necessarily brief, but we did want to just briefly outline why we consider regulation to be so fundamental to the discussions that we're having this week, why it's really an essential building block if we're to achieve universal access. So there were 3 points that we wanted to highlight here. So firstly, regulatory frameworks are essential for developing acceptable standards for service delivery. In addition to providing those standards for service providers to follow, they also provide those mandated institutions with incentives and promote accountability of those service providers. And in our judgment, and I think the judgment of most of us in the sector, these are really essential ingredients for providing sustainable services at citywide scale in the context of on-site sanitation specifically. So there's much more to be said there, and more will be said as we move through the content. So I think it's also necessary in the context of this session that you understand who ESAWAS is. ESAWAS is actually quite a newly formed organization. So I'm going to invite Peter Nyaga to just briefly outline ESAWAS and its role.
Yes, good morning. Just wondering how many of you understand what the acronym ESAWAS means. That's why I want to explain. The full meaning of ESAWAS is the Eastern and Southern Africa Water Sanitation Regulatory Association. These are associations of regulators in the Thank you. Yeah, I was explaining that ESAWAS means Eastern and Southern Africa Water and Sanitation Regulatory Association. And this is an association that was formed in the year 2007 out of the need to improve standards, efficiency, and enhance consumer protection in the provision of water and sanitation services. At the moment, it has 10 members, and the members include Kenya, Tanzania, there is Zanzibar, there is Rwanda, Burundi, there is Zambia, there is Mozambique, there is Lesotho, and then we have Malawi and Uganda. So, and it's growing. And how did it come about? Regulators every year do what we call performance assessment of the utilities, and the performance assessment is quite key because it's on the basis of that utilities are able to know their performance and on which areas to improve. There was a challenge within the member countries. We had the bigger utilities that felt we are too big when it comes to benchmarking or performance assessment to be compared with the small one. And so in order to address that problem, ESAWAS came up, and one of the key outputs of ESAWAS every year is a benchmarking report, and which can be found in the ESAWAS website, where we take the largest utility in each country, and then we compare it with the largest utility in the other country. And if you read through the report, you find it's been very interesting. Those who thought they were the giants in their individual countries, sometimes they find their performance is not good. But the whole objective is about performance improvement. So what are some of the key achievements of ESAWAS so far? It's the benchmarking report. And then the other key output is that every year we do what we call a peer review. The members country go to another member country just to find out how is regulation working there, what can be improved, what can be translated and work in another country. So through that comparison, we are seeing some sort of a gradual improvement in the provision of water and sanitation. Thank you.
Mike, thank you very much. So this session actually came out from discussions between WhatsApp and ESAWAS at the ESAWAS General Meeting in Kigali earlier this year. What we wanted to do is kind of give a sense of the diversity of regulatory initiatives that are now being enacted across ESAWAS countries. Each of the initiatives that we're going to feature today are actually quite recent and still need to be fully implemented, so it's a good time to be discussing some of the challenges that remain around implementation. As we move through each of these case studies, we're going to try and refer back to the conference themes around impact, scalability, and particularly transferability, and also equity. So we're going to break down the session into 3 parts. First part, we're going to look at developing regulatory frameworks for on-site sanitation. And we have a very significant initiative led by Peter Mutale at NOASCO to present. After each presentation, we're then going to have some time for discussion and to get your views. Second part, we're going to hear quite an inspirational example from WASREP of introducing a pro-poor key performance indicator to incentivize service provision to low-income areas in Kenya, low-income urban areas. And then we're going to look at, in a sense, the interface between financing and regulation. So we're going to look at sanitation tariffs, or sometimes also referred to as sanitation surcharges, and how those might be applied to address financing gaps and support improved citywide sanitation. And we've got 2 examples there from Mozambique, from the regulator CRA, and from Kenya. Okay, so that's enough context. We're going to go to our first presentation. So I invite Peter Mutale from NOASCO.
Good morning, everyone. Okay, I've already been introduced. I'm Peter Mutale. I'm from NOASCO. I'm the Chief Inspector for NOASCO. My presentation is on the experiences from Zambia, extending regulation to urban on-site sanitation and rural water supply and sanitation. But I'll try to focus more on on-site sanitation. We have got partners. If you see those logos there is GIZ, there's GFA. Of course, there's also government that have been supporting us in the process. The background, in terms of my outline, I've got the current situation on sanitation and rural, the new regulatory framework for urban and rural. I've got recommendations and also the lessons learned, conclusions and challenges. In terms of Zambia, we would see that Zambia is on the southern part of Equator, not far away from South Africa. I'll not talk about this. Maybe I'll come to this part. I just want to give you a picture that sanitation has been lagging behind. If you look at the report of 2017, you would see that urban sanitation is quite low compared to, rural sanitation. Let me put it this way. Rural sanitation is quite low. Urban sanitation is still showing like it's low, but higher than rural. Urban water coverage is quite up compared to the rural. But also, if you look at sanitation and water, sanitation has been lagging behind, and that's the reason why we are looking at extending regulation to those areas. Now, when you look at the sub-Sahara and also Zambia, in terms of hygiene, we have performed quite well. If you look at the coverage levels, we are within the average of the region. Sorry, what's happening? Okay, coming to maybe, I know some of the parts are, let me just do this, sorry. Wow, what's happening now? Okay, let me just. Okay, yeah. Yeah, so these I've already talked about them. I've talked about the sub-region and also Zambia in terms of how we are performing in terms of hygiene, basic hygiene. If we look at Zambia, we're at 14%. The region is at about 15%, which means that we are actually above the average. Now, in terms of our reforms in Zambia, we started way back in 1989 when we formed the first commercial utility. But in earnest, I don't know. Oh yeah, so in earnest, we started our reforms in 1993. We had our policy, National Water Policy in 1994. The 1997 National Water Supply and Sanitation Act, which actually formed NOASCO, and also the commercial utilities. If you look from there, you'll see that NOASCO to date, we are regulating 11 commercial utilities across the country and 6 private schemes. We have several programs as a country which have been aligned to the SDGs. If you see the Vision 2030 is fully aligned. Maybe I can go. I don't know what's happening. Okay, there is some technical issue that is being addressed. So, so basically, okay, it's back now. Thank you. What I was talking about is that in Zambia, I've got several programs. We have the Vision 2030, which is looking at universal coverage, and it's so much aligned with SDGs. We have got all those programs, but if you come to the last program, is the open defecation free strategy. So we are aiming at ensuring that by 2030, no one is going in the bush. We hope we can achieve that. In terms of NGO commitments and targets, you can see that we have got issues to do with inequalities, issues to do with inclusiveness, issues of ensuring that there is monitoring in place. I think as NWASCO, we have responded to these NGO commitments. You can see that from the bottom there, NWASCO has revised its NWASCO information system to link it to actually the rural system, which we call the DHIS2. And we have also included things like self-managed sanitation, basic sanitation, and all other things that are supposed to be achieved under the SDGs. If you look up there on those other inequities and inequalities and also inclusiveness, we have actually revised our regulation to include everyone, the rural and also the on-site sanitation, which have not been regulated since we started operating in 2000 as NWASCO. Now, when you look at the current situation in Zambia at the moment, we will see that we do not have sufficient information on sanitation matters. What you see that the standards are not there, coordination among different players is not there. We have not agreed on what is acceptable sanitation. Enforcement of standards has been a problem. So those are some of the issues that we see that is there in Zambia at the moment. We see that in terms of dumping of sludge, we have a lot of illegal dumping of sludge. We have this unhealthy emptying of sanitation facilities. You can see that is a bit more improved. We are trying to do one or two things, but mostly it's an improved unhealthy emptying of on-site sanitation facilities. What we also see is that in terms of pricing for on-site sanitation, there is no control pricing. So some of the customers may find these services unaffordable because there is no regulator to check on what is being charged. If you come to rural, I don't want to mention so much, but we're also moving into rural regulation, both on-site sanitation and also water supply. Those are the issues that are in the rural areas now. Drinking water quality, the quality is not assured because close monitoring is not there. We have problem with information gathering in rural areas. Much as we have made efforts to do that DHIS2 by the ministry and also the SOMAP by the ministry, we still see that information gathering and maintenance issues are still a problem in rural areas. So it's the same thing, what we see in rural areas. There are so many players in the rural areas, but the interventions are not really coordinated. And this is what we are trying to bring in so that coordination is there. Now, when it comes to the new regulatory framework, I think the most important thing that I should mention to you is that NWASCO now is going to issue a license to all the commercial utilities to cover both on-site and off-site sanitation, which is within their mandate. Other players like the ministry, the local authorities, Zambia Environmental Management Agency, Water Resources Management Authority, they'll continue with their roles. But of course, the commercial utilities, as I've said, they will take up now on-site sanitation. in terms of their roles. Now, when it comes to the new framework, I don't want to get word by word, but I need just to mention to you that we have got a ministry on top there in charge. Then we have got NWASCO, we have got ZEMA. But of course, NWASCO now is going to issue only one license to each town or each district or to each commercial utility. Then whoever wants to provide a service to do with on-site sanitation, whether private or community-based, has to work with a contract from a licensed provider. And of course, a permit will be issued through a commercial utility for anyone to work under that license. So basically, that's what we are looking at in terms of the new framework. And this is a framework that we have agreed upon as a country, as all stakeholders involved in water supply and sanitation services. Now, when it comes to issues to do with the approach, I don't want to mention so much. You all know that we have got this sanitation service chain. What we are saying is that for off-site sanitation system, we want to give this to the commercial utilities who are professionals to manage up to the disposal and reuse, that is agricultural or other uses. The other category, we are saying that for formal areas, yes, we want to put up septic tanks, and these septic tanks will be managed by commercial utilities or private operators until the end of the value chain. Then for the peri-urban areas, which are informal settlements, we are saying pit latrines, also septic tanks to some extent will be used, and that will be the means for emptying transportation up to the end point. So this is what we have proposed, and that's what we are going to follow. Now, in terms of rural water supply, I don't want to emphasize so much on this. What we have also done is that the commercial utilities now have been given a license to provide water supply and sanitation both in urban and rural areas. Urban including peri-urban areas. So whoever wants to operate in rural areas will operate under a license provided by the commercial utilities. So this is also the framework, the existing and the old. What I've said, I think, is what is explained in this arrangement. This is just purely a summary showing the breakdown in terms of urban. Urban, we have got urban and peri-urban, and who is going to be responsible. For rural, we have got the growth centers, those areas which are more or less like urban areas, but they're in rural areas. We have got rural institutions. We have got also rural settlements, like the water points, where we have hand pumps and protected wells. This is also the arrangement that will be happening there. But overall, the CU will be responsible for whatever arrangement that will take place in these rural areas. Now, in terms of framework, I should mention to you that when we started looking at the regulatory framework, we had to consult the institutional and legal framework existing at the time. And we clarified the laws that each person was supposed to play, each institution was supposed to play, and that one has been agreed upon. The next stage we went to was to look at the licenses for commercial utilities, which we have amended, and we have also amended the service level guarantees and agreements to include the new area of on-site sanitation. Also, as NWASCO, we don't work without guidelines. We have also revised our guidelines. Some of them will be concluded this quarter because we are waiting for a few consultations. So that has also been done in draft form. Number 4, we are also developing what we are calling the national standards or a code of practice, which we are calling on-site sanitation system and fecal sludge management code of practice. This one is being developed actually by our Zambia Bureau of Standards with all the stakeholders involved. Because what we believe is that without the standards, it will be very difficult for us actually to work as a regulator and also even for the commercial utilities. In terms of data collection and reporting, we have also developed a framework how we are going to collect data and information in the rural areas and also on-site sanitation. If you look at number 6, us as NWASCO, we have got a NWASCO information system. We have actually devised this national NWASCO information system to make it web-based and to include on-site sanitation, as well as rural water supply. So this has been done and linked to the DHIS2, which is now managed by our ministry. If you look at the NWASCO capacity, we have been actually been to a number of countries, been to a number of institutions to learn and get the capacity. But also in our 2019 budget, we are going to employ extra staff who look into the rural and also urban on-site sanitation. Now, to implement these frameworks that we have developed, we are actually forming what we are calling a joint implementation team called JIT. And this will have all stakeholders on board so that as we implement, everyone should be put in the same boat. So these actually will see that 3 commercial treaties this year will be targeted to ensure that we operationalize the same frameworks. In terms of regulation, as NWASCO, we are starting this year. We don't want to postpone this any further. We'll start slowly but surely. It's a mammoth task, but it's something that is not insurmountable. Now, coming to recommendations and lessons learned, I should mention to you that you need, first of all, to articulate your current situation and also present what you want to see in future so that that becomes your selling tool as you go to other stakeholders. The second part is the issue of clarity of laws. It is very important that we clarify the laws. You know, these are multifaceted issues. Rural on-site sanitation, they are multifaceted. So roles and responsibilities have to be very clear. Rules, regulations, and standards need to be very effective for you to move forward. Engagement of key stakeholders for consensus building cannot be overemphasized. We actually consulted nearly everyone to come up with these frameworks. In terms of moving to rural and urban on-site sanitation, you need a special purpose vehicle. What I mean by that is that you need to have an institution that should fund the initial projects. In Zambia, when we are moving to peri-urban areas, we came up with a devolution trust fund, which we used as a special purpose vehicle. So even for this one, we are saying we need such a vehicle that will give initial capital to on-site sanitation and rural areas. Data management has to be enhanced. GIS mapping becomes very crucial. In Zambia, actually, now we have ensured that each and every commercial utility has a functioning GIS system. But on top of that, we are also supporting all of them to ensure that they do the mapping. In terms of data, we are saying that we should have comprehensive surveys on existing forms of sanitation. Without this, it's very difficult to regulate, it's very difficult to provide services. And we are also supporting that through our resource center. In terms of the business model for provision of fecal sludge management, this is needed like yesterday. As you may be aware, on-site sanitation business has been unregulated for a long time. So you need to come up with a business model under which everyone should operate. And this has been developed, but consultations are still being finalized. As I said, this being a multifaceted area, on-site sanitation, we need to develop collaborative framework with key stakeholders. So for us, we have looked at local authorities, we have looked at our agents in charge of environmental and other agencies so that we sign those collaborative frameworks so that no one is left behind. In terms of conclusion, I'm saying that with a daunting task of universal access under SDGs for self-managed services, on-site sanitation and rural water supply and sanitation need to be regulated. They should not remain unregulated. Otherwise, it will be difficult, even maybe impossible, to achieve those things. Of course, with rules, regulations, and legal framework in place, the challenge remains with enforcement. Many of us, we have caught beautiful legislation, beautiful things in place, but enforcement is a problem. So you need to put in workable enforcement mechanisms. That's why we are developing even bylaws, and we're also revising our Water Supply and Sanitation Act to ensure that we have got those workable mechanisms in place. In terms of the last bit, I just want to mention to you that regulation of on-site sanitation and rural water supply and sanitation is achievable with right tools in place. I think I should end here so that I give more time to you to ask questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. Superb. We briefed Peter to speak for 20 minutes, and he's actually come in at 18 minutes, so that was outstanding. Thank you so much. So this is your opportunity now. Any questions that you have for Peter? Yep.
I'm just curious to know about the performance indicator. How you define indicators to monitor the performance of the private operator. Thank you.
Got a mic coming to you, Peter.
Okay, thank you very much. Maybe I should mention to you that these are initiatives that are in progress, but what we have done is that in trying to develop the frameworks, we have devised the indicators, the minimum service levels for private operators, but also there are conditions that will be set for all those that are going to work under the license of a licensed provider. So as they sign the contract, those conditions will be clear. In terms of, like, for instance, ensuring that they are taking sludge to the right places, the requirement you are putting there is that the commercial utility who has a license will get the money, and then the one who is emptying will just go and empty and take the sludge where it's supposed to go. Then once we confirm that they have taken the sludge where it's supposed to go, then they go and get the money. But also the issue of the GPS system to be fitted on these vehicles, it will be also a requirement. So we have put in a number of requirements for those private operators through our new regulated framework. When it has progressed so well, maybe the next SAN will come and report more of progress than today. Thank you.
Questions? Yeah.
Mine is just a clarification on your responsibilities between the ministry responsible for water and the ministry responsible for health. A sanitation policy, I'm sure you have it in place. Just I wanted to know, it belongs to which ministry? Ministry of Health or Ministry of Water? Thank you.
Thank you. That is a very important issue or question. As I mentioned, this is a multifaceted issue. We know that the one who is responsible for water supply and sanitation in Zambia is now the Ministry of Water, Sanitation and Environmental Protection. Now, the Ministry of Health, because of the health part, they always come to enforce public health. And in Zambia, they do it through the local authorities. They have delegated this function. So now, once it comes to on-site sanitation, what I've talked about, there is the part of facilities and also the provision of a service. So if you're looking at issues to do with the kind of facilities that have to be constructed, the local authorities, using the Public Health Act from the Ministry of Health, they'll come and enforce to make sure that each and every individual has got a toilet according to the standard. And then if somebody refuses to have the septic tank or pit latrine emptied, the local authorities will come through the Public Health Act to enforce, to ensure that that person has done that one. If you don't construct a proper facility, the Ministry of Health through the local authorities will come and force you to have that facility. Now, when it comes to service provision, it is very clear that the local authorities are supposed to provide the services, but they have delegated this function to the commercial utilities, who are now in charge of both on-site and off-site. And the regulator also will regulate both on-site and off-site. So the Ministry of Health will only come in to enforce public health issues. I hope I'm clear on that point. Thank you.
Any other questions? Sorry, that came out very loud. No. Peter, I wanted to ask you one question, maybe to wrap this up. I think it might be helpful if you just gave a sense of the journey that you've been on in Zambia, because this is quite an evolution. from a fairly low level of on-site sanitation service provision to having the regulatory framework in place, having the prospect of moving towards citywide FSM services through the Lusaka sanitation project. I just wanted to invite some reflections on kind of the initial impetus or the background to this movement to developing the framework.
Okay, thank you very much. I was given too little time in my presentation, so I just want to mention to you that for a long time in Zambia, since we started providing water supply and sanitation services through commercial utilities, and mainly in 2000, our focus has been mainly on sewage systems. We actually deliberately called our water companies water and sewerage companies to avoid the on-site sanitation aspect. But in the Act, it's very clear that as a regulator, we're supposed to regulate both on-site and off-site. And also the commercial utility, they're supposed to do both on-site and off-site. So when we saw that this is within our mandate, we said, what do we do? So in 2015, actually, we started the process. We had to do a lot of reviews in terms of the laws, in terms of responsibilities, in terms of legal framework, to make sure that we are clear in terms of we're supposed to do what. And then from there, we had to now look at what is our current situation, as I said, and then where we do want to be. Then we had to form what we are calling a technical working group. Of course, with support from GIZ, they have been our good partner. We formed a technical working group, which was now trying to look at everything that was happening in the country and trying to project what we want to see in the future. So we did a lot of consultations in terms of what framework we should take, and also taking advantage that in Zambia, we have received about 300 million, close to 300 million US dollars for Lusaka to support sanitation. So we said, let's also ride on this funding so that we introduce this aspect. So after all the consultations, we came up with the frameworks and we agreed. And last year in June 2018, we had these frameworks launched for both on-site sanitation and also rural. So in these frameworks, we have actually defined how the services will be provided, and we have also defined how the services will be regulated. So now this year, which is 2019, we are now thinking of starting to regulate. We know that we cannot be in theories, in concepts. We need to move into practice. Because we are told that if you climb the mountains, you will not know that there are other mountains until you reach that top. So we need to keep climbing until you reach on top. So we said this year we get started with whatever that is there. We have developed tools because we cannot regulate without tools. So for us, we have done the guidelines, we have looked at the standards and everything, so that when we start regulating, we should have the right tools in place. So it was a long journey from 2015, and this is 2019. So you can see that it's not a short process, but a longer process, but it's worth it for consensus building. So that is what I wanted to say.
Okay, we're going to take this last question and then we're going to move on to the next part of the session.
Thank you. My name is Oswald Chanda. I would like to find out about regulating rural areas or on-site sanitation. Now, when you are regulating, you're putting in standards, you're putting in regulations so that there is compliance. On the other end, you either should have incentives or a stick to ensure that if there's no compliance, you either come in with a stick or there are incentives to attract those who have to follow these regulations. Now, in this case, could you just, I know you haven't gotten there yet, could you just explain to us what you plan to use? What do you envisage? I know it's a little bit theoretical because you have not yet been there, but it's important to have that at the back of the mind. Thank you.
Okay, I can answer that quickly. But before I answer, maybe let me just mention that Mr. Oswald Chanda actually was the first chief executive for NWASCO. So even as he speaks from an informed point of view. So I have to disclose that aspect. Yeah, the thing is that, yes, he's right. I mentioned that there should be a special purpose vehicle. When we are moving into paid urban areas, most of the people said, no, it's a no-go area. But what we did was that we actually had to set up a devotion trust fund. which was a fund where government was putting money, cooperating partners, and we were giving grants to commercial utilities. When we had set this momentum, the commercial utilities became willing actually to move in peri-urban areas on their own. So as I mentioned, this fund will still come because we need the initial parts to ensure that we have got those funds. But in terms of whipping, I think we'll not stop as a regulator. We have incentives that we have put in place, and we also have penalties that we have put in place. So we ensure that we implement these things as we move on. As I said, when we come to the next Africa Sun, we'll come and tell you about the incentives that we are giving and also the whipping, the penalties that we are giving. So we'll continue the way we are doing things here, except that there's just an extension in terms of what we are doing. So I think that's what I can say for now. Thank you.
Well done. Thank you very much. I'm sorry, but we're going to have to wrap this part up. I'm also sorry that I didn't request questioners to give their name and organisation. It can be very important context, as per the last question, but we'll do that for the next part. Round of applause for Peter again. Thank you. Okay, a little bit wonky with the box there, but so we're moving on to the second part of the session. This is quite a different type of regulatory initiative. This is led by WASREB, the regulator in Kenya. So I'm going to invite Peter Njaga to tell you about this initiative to introduce a ProPOR key performance indicator for urban utilities in Kenya.
Yes, good morning. Good afternoon, good morning. Yes, my name is Peter, and you notice the previous presenter name was also Peter. Those who went to Sunday school, you know about Peter the Rock, isn't it? So today's presentation is based on Peter the Rock, and the implication is of that is that matters sanitation must be built on solid rock for impact, reliability, and scalability. I want to talk to you about a very, very, very practical way. The session today is on policy, institution, and regulation. That's what the session is about. So the question I'll be seeking to answer, when the policy is correct, when the legal framework is correct, what do the institutions put in place need to do to ensure that the people in the informal settlement get services? Sanitation to the urban poor, Kenya comes from the constitution. In 2010, Kenya put in place a new constitution, and the new constitution under the Bill of Rights put it clearly that every citizen, every person is entitled to reasonable standard of sanitation. So that is the beginning point. So what that means is that the legal framework was okay, and then to make it operational, we had the Water Act to operationalize the constitution. That's also duplicated the same, that every citizen is entitled to a reasonable standard of sanitation. Then what did that mean? Institutions were also formed with responsibility of water and sanitation provision, and in the Kenyan context, we call them water supply providers. But as many of you will know, these institutions were formed on a commercial basis. Many of them did not want to go and do business in the informal settlement. They considered this as, there's no money, these people are the poor, it is dangerous, it is cartels, it's not fashionable. But now, if you look at the constitution, everybody was actually entitled to reasonable standard of sanitation. So the question came to the regulator, what do regulation need to do to make sure that this institution actually put their attention to the low-income areas? Before this happened, the regulator used to track performance of these utilities, and there was no compelling reason for the regulator to really focus on the low-income areas. The other thing is that before this focus on the informal areas, was that the reporting by these utilities was also very misleading. And I want to give an example. Probably a good number of you have been to Nairobi. You would find like the utility in Nairobi reporting that in terms of sanitation coverage, we are probably 50%. Just one figure. But if you unbundle that figure, there was a lot of inequality. Yeah, there were people who had nil, who had nothing. And so there was need for the regulator to move a little bit deeper to ensure that these utilities, whose mandate is to give service to the informal areas, get to these areas. I mean, focus on these low-income areas. The number of utilities in Kenya, there are many. There are about 88. You can imagine comparing that to 11. So it's quite a big. Zambia, they've said 11. Kenya, there are 88. And it's quite a huge task to needed to regulate them. Now, let's focus on the urban areas. That's where the big problem is in the Kenyan situation. Within the urban areas, the population covered by the existing utilities is about 21 million. And about 8 million of them are residing in the 2,000 urban low-income areas. So that's already a problem. So you cannot have utilities, tending to cover some areas, and then there's a very large population in the low-income areas, and then there's no proper focus of that. And according to the National Master Plan, the population is growing very fast. It is projected by the year 2030, there will be about 46 million people living in urban areas, and most of them in this informal settlement. By 2050, the population is projected to be 65 million. So you see, from those figures, really, you cannot ignore action in the informal settlements. People will still come, and the population will still continue to grow. Now, that being the case, there was need for the regulator to be able to come up with some sort of pro-poor service delivery within each WSP that was not there before. What happened is that a KPI was developed that was basically focusing on the low-income areas, but as regulators here, our president know that the process of developing the KPI is very consultative. The process was very consultative. There was a lot of stakeholders, were consulted, and of course we got support from WSUP in mapping the service areas, and of course in collection of data. Now, during the process of consultation, a few key issues came up. One of them is that there was lack of up-to-date information about the poor. Who are they and where they live? Sometimes it's very difficult to define who are the poor. You go to those informal areas, you sometimes find some rich persons who live there, and that's why they want that kind of status quo to remain. You even tell them, we'll build new houses for you. You take them there, they don't go, they also go back. So this is a challenge we have, and it's very practical. We've tried in Kenya. You give them houses, then they rent them out, then they go back to the life they are used to. The other challenge was there was a low tariff, but this was a perceived inability to pay connection fees and interference from the informal vendors, but that was a perception. And again, they were perceived as a high risk, and so no need to go and do any business there for utilities. There were a lot of governance and integrity issues, and there were also challenges in investment funding, and it was generally difficult to give deliver service in those areas. So these are the issues that came up. However, a new KPI was performed focusing on these areas, and these KPIs, its purpose was not only to monitor the level of poor service provision, but offer guidance on the WSPs. So what were the sub-indicators under this KPI? One was, does the WSP have a poor strategy, work plan, and budget? That was one of the sub-indicators. There's a tool that was rating them on that. Does the WSP have a poor unit? That was the second sub-indicator. Have these areas been mapped, the poor areas? And then what is the water coverage and per capita consumption? The other sub-indicator, which is the focus for this meeting, is the sanitation coverage. What's the level of sanitation coverage? And then there are also continuity of service, the level of wastages, and the subsidies. So those were the sub-indicators, and the tool was developed to be able to rate the performance in those areas. Now, initially there was a pilot that was carried out that involved 9 very large utilities. In Kenya, we have classified utilities in terms of size, in terms of number of connections. If a utility has over 35,000 connections, it's classified as large. If it has between 10 and 35, if it's over 35,000, it's classified as very large. 10,000 and 35 as large, and then between 5 and 10 as medium, and less than 5,000 as small. So this pilot was done with the very large utilities because that is where the problem is. If you have got to get the maximum impact, you begin with where the biggest problem is. And within 1 year, the proposed score increased from 56 to 66% in 1 year. When we just decided to focus on these 9, by mapping their informal areas, and then focusing on the performance of these indicators, there was quite a big margin. And then going forward, an additional 31 very large and large WSPs have been added to the pilot, and we'll be releasing these results in April this year. Now, so you've seen that this KPI is actually is very important because it's really a turning point for the utilities to focus on these WSPs, on these low-income areas. And going forward, we are going to upscale it to cover many more, utilities. But I want to share with you, because the section is about regulation, what are the regulatory actions being done to now reach these underserved? What is the ongoing action now? One of the ongoing actions that is key to make sure that there is focus on these low-income areas is mapping of the utility service areas with the 2 objectives: to be able to identify the low-income areas so that enforcement can actually be easily done. And the other one was to identify the informal providers in this area with the objective of ensuring that service delivery is only by regulated utilities. That is very key towards focusing on the low-income areas. The other regulatory action that's going on, there is licensing going on right now in Kenya based on targets for low-income areas. When a utility gets a license now, you don't only get targets for your entire service area, but there are specific targets for the low-income areas because they have already been identified. The third thing is that we already have an information collection system, which we call WARIS, and that system is being upgraded to introduce a module for low-income areas, so that as utilities key in data, they will also key in data with respect to performance for the low-income areas. And the other initiative is a performance review and public reporting. Public reporting is very key because when this information is published, then the public, the duty bearers actually, they have an obligation to make sure that they are accountable to the public. And then the other ongoing thing is the upscaling of the ProPUA indicator as we move forward. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Peter. We have about 5 minutes for some discussion. So any questions for Peter? And if you can give your name and organization.
Thank you, Peter, for a very good presentation. My name is Titus Safari from EURA, Tanzania. Just one question on the verification of the data and upgrading the information that is provided in the WARIS, especially in the low-income areas. And we have a challenge in our case in Tanzania in terms of verification and updating of the information. Can you share a little bit more how you are going about that? Thank you.
Thank you very much. We also had that challenge in our early years. And as you know, utilities like to look good all the time. So they'll key in the figures so that they can look that they are quite progressive. You have the managing director, they want to retain their position, they won't say that we have done well this year. So initially, when we began doing a performance assessment, before we focused on the ProPUA, we also used to get that challenge. But what we did is that we upgraded our system such that if today, or say last year, if you enter data for last year and you key in that non-revenue water, you are probably at 50%. And then the following year, you say you are 30%. The system will not take that. You have to write a thesis, my friend. It will not key in that. If the data entry clerk will not be able to do it, it has got to go up to MD level, it will not go in that. We've got an online system. So that is the kind of system we are putting to be able to validate that data. If coverage in the low-income areas, you put in your 10, then you realize, oh, now this one is counting towards our performance. This year, give an instruction as MD, put 20. Again, you have to write a thesis, you have to demonstrate what actually happened that you had this 10 percentage point change. All these are inbuilt in the system. So those are some of the things that we've done. We've put them in the system to help us in validation. Thank you.
Super.
Good morning. Is it afternoon? Good afternoon. My name is Siwangile. I work with water and sanitation for the urban poor. One of the things that you stressed is that you've given targets for utilities to be able, or water providers to be able to reach the low-income areas. But you also mentioned that one of the issues why they didn't want to go there in the first place is because the money that they get from there is not that much. So how are you ensuring that you're striking a balance between the tariffs that you are asking them to peg on the low-income areas does not stretch them economically? Because if the tariffs are really low, it means that they have to incur additional costs. Thank you.
Thank you. I think the issue that the low-income area, that's where the poorest of the poorest were in the society. That was, first of all, a misconception. That is something that was in their mind. The other thing is that we are also asking them to be innovative. There are many means of payment. If you ask you apply technology like the prepaid, you can also install in this, if it's water, you can use that kind of technology. Use the mobile phone technology to be able to pay. If the informal areas, do not sometimes bill them monthly. You can bill them even weekly, because what they don't like are huge bills that come after 3-4 months. So if you sort out all those things, you find that they are among the best payers. And then, of course, the question of service. What the utilities needed to demonstrate that when they get services from the formal utilities, when the informal areas are getting service from the formal utilities, it is much cheaper. And that can only be demonstrated by the utilities getting there. And once the people who live in the informal settlement understand that, then they have no problem in paying. Because otherwise, the way they get it in a very expensive way. In the informal area, there are people who have put up toilet ablution blocks privately, and it's quite expensive. So it's better if these facilities are run by the utility.
Any other questions? Okay, we'll make this our final question.
My name is Jackson Tazamba. I'm coming from Ministry of Water in Tanzania. My question is regarding the KPIs which have been developed. You talk about going to support you are pro-poor, but you are going into the peri-urban areas. Do you have any plans of upscaling up to the village level? Because you start with those who are in peri-urban areas, but I know the really poor are in the villages. I don't know whether that's your area of concern, or you just leave them to, because we are talking about not leaving anyone behind. So can you tell us a little bit on what are you going to do in other in rural areas? Thank you.
Yes, there's a scalability. I think I mentioned about that. And if you look at water service provision within the country, where is the largest crisis? It's in those high-density areas. So, and that's why, we began by calling out pilot of the 9 utilities that are very large. That's where there's high concentration. We've already done that. And now we are moving to bringing another board about 31. And then after that, gradually with time, we'll move to the rural areas. The rural areas, the crisis is not so much, because you can put a pit latrine here. When it fills up, just bury it and go to the next position, isn't it? But in the urban areas, it has got to be in the same position. It cannot move because the plots are small and all that kind of thing. So that's where the crisis is. So, and we're doing very well on that. We're seeing a lot of focus over utilities getting there, and we'll go upscaling it, as we move forward.
Okay, thank you. I have a question for all of you at this point before we go to the final section. We're interested in transferability. I'm just curious if anyone has experience to share, maybe if you're a delegate from another African country, either around developing a regulatory framework for on-site sanitation of the type that NOASCO have been developing, or around introducing KPIs to incentivize pro-poor service provision, as Peter's been describing. That may not be the case. We're not really aware of analogous examples, but I wanted to put that to you. Any experience to share?
Yeah. Hi, yeah. Mr. Thomason from GIZ. As far as I know, that is the first comprehensive framework for rural water supply and sanitation and for peri-urban sanitation in this form in sub-Saharan Africa. I don't know it from elsewhere. And that is also why people are getting interested in it. And there have been some questions about it. How can you manage? I mean, it's an illusion for the regulator to monitor the quality of all rural latrines. We know it. This is not possible. The idea initially came up also because we said we don't have a monitoring system, an information system on access in Zambia. So the ministry was not able to handle that. So we said, but the regulator does the urban system, so technically he can do the rural system. That was one of the key points to move over. The second one was, how do you handle small, what we call rural growth centers, yeah? Locations with small pipe systems, which can also not only be handled by utilities, and on the other hand cannot be handled by what we call communal structures. Yeah, in West Africa we have thousands, 10,000 of them, and they also came to the point, if we do not regulate that, we are getting lost, because the local government is, by matter of fact, the regulator of these systems. They have the constitutional responsibility for water supply and sanitation in Zambia. So if you don't give them tools, these officers will not be able to handle that point. Yeah, and those were some key elements to do that for the rural and sanitation. Yeah, for the peri-urban sanitation, it was the same logic. In the beginning, there was a discussion that somebody asked, why are you not doing rural, Navasco? And everybody said, because we are doing urban. So, and we said, but in your Water Act, there is no rural, there is no urban, so your mandate is the entire sector. So then it took another half a year or a year before it became a mainstream, and we said, okay, we have to do it somehow, because it's our mandate. Yeah. So this is a bit the background to that discussion. Thank you.
Very interesting, thank you. Okay, a round of applause again for Peter Njaga, thank you. Okay, we're going to go on to the final part of this session. So now we're moving on, as I mentioned earlier, really to the interface between financing and regulation, and we're going to look at some examples of sanitation surcharges. So I'm going to ask my colleague Baggy Bagirifan from WhatsApp, but he's really representing CRA today, the regulator in Mozambique. He's going to talk about experience developing a sanitation tariff in Maputo.
Thank you, Sam. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. So WASUP has been supporting the regulator, CRA, and the municipality in Mozambique on this journey. So this is really an example of a journey that is still not concluded in a location, in a city where the baseline situation in terms of on-site sanitation and regulation, and indeed sanitation even at a city level, had been quite low for a very long time. So there had been some policy decisions taken to improve that situation. And of course, fundamental to this in a wide-ranging impact on the whole thing, but the fundamental situation on all these things is also the financing, which had been extremely low in Maputo for a long time, both in terms of the on-site sanitation, it had been very low or non-existent in terms of investments. In terms of the network sanitation, it had been pretty low as well, and therefore the service provision and functioning of the existing infrastructure was also at a relatively poor level. So part of the whole journey was to bring together the stakeholders to look at a range of aspects in terms of improved service at a citywide level, particularly on on-site sanitation. So these statistics are with regard to Mozambique as a country, where the current situation or the sanitation situation certainly a few years ago was extremely low. In fact, I was in a meeting this morning on open defecation, where Mozambique again had been featured as one of the countries in Africa where ODF levels are still high. So the decision to move forward with a sanitation surcharge or tariff was looking at the financing in terms of sanitation, which was at a relatively lower level. And even in terms of the network sanitation, there was no tariffs which were being secured from the households which were connected to the network. So there was a real lack of financing, which had to be dependent very much on local government and central government budget expenditures for service provision as well as operations. So having decided on wanting to develop sanitation at a citywide service level at an acceptable standard, to upgrade the on-site sanitation service levels, there was a need to look at the financing in a much more comprehensive manner. And therefore, the introduction of a sanitation surcharge was recognized as being a necessary part of that whole framework and arrangement. So the regulator CRA then consulted with the municipality and other stakeholders. The municipality has a mandate for service provision for on-site sanitation and sanitation, network sanitation as well. So they have a responsibility. And the drainage policy, which was developed and approved by the municipality CMM in 2016, provided the impetus and a basis to move forward in formulating and introducing a sanitation surcharge, which would help with the whole process of improving sanitation services and helping to finance service provision. So there was a period of 5 years when this process had to be, was moved forward. WSUP, together with WSP at the time in Mozambique, started then working together with the regulator and the municipality in undertaking detailed analysis, baseline surveys, and through that developed the basis for introducing a sanitation tariff or surcharge. It also meant, of course, developing a regulatory framework to define eligible services. The process is still carrying on, but it has moved forward quite significantly in the past 12 months because there has been a political will and commitment to move this forward and to introduce the sanitation surcharge. So part of this process has been to develop a regulatory framework in the form of collaborative agreement between the regulator and the municipality, which will have a responsibility for the service provision, and that to be supported in terms by a mechanism for billing and revenue collection of the surcharge, which will be undertaken through the water bills, the water tariff. The surcharge will be levied at the middle and high income groups, and there will be a safeguard for the low income consumers of the of water. So those consuming more than 5 cubic meters per month will be paying the surcharge. The level of the surcharge is still under discussion. And the responsibility for the performance management will be defined within the regulatory framework and the collaborative agreement. And the revenue collection from the surcharge will be used for improving the sanitation service provision, as including investments in infrastructure. The specific criteria and the areas of that are yet to be defined and will be formed part of the consultation currently in progress. It's expected that the surcharge will be used to support improved FSM services and better management and monitoring of the wastewater treatment system itself, which has also been lacking. So the next steps in this process, which is still carrying on, will be to start implementing the tariff, the surcharge, but prior to that is to complete the definition of the collaborative framework and the criteria for the use of the revenue collected from the surcharge, which at the moment is expected to be estimated at between $3 to $4 million a year. And this would then form one part of the sanitation financing that is much needed in the city. So part of this whole process and the journey is an example of a city that had started off at a low baseline in moving forward the whole process of improved sanitation services, both for network sanitation and on-site sanitation, and looking at it in a wider frame, including the financing, and through that deciding to progress with the implementation of a sanitation surcharge. Thank you.
Applause for Baggy, thank you. So we'll give you a chance to put questions to Baggy in just a moment, if you make a mental note of them. But before we go on to the discussion around surcharges, we just wanted to give a second example, which is to introduce a sanitation surcharge in Kenya. So again, this is just closely connected, really led by WASREP. And what we wanted to do is just briefly outline some research that has been conducted to support that process. So as background, WASREP have had in mind this aspiration to introduce a surcharge for some time. This research was commissioned under WASREP's Urban Sanitation Research Initiative, really to strengthen the evidence base for introducing that surcharge. So it was concerned with the willingness to pay of utility customers for a pro-poor sanitation surcharge. And it was also importantly interested in factors that influence willingness to pay, whether that's around the messaging that is included on the water bill, the sense of solidarity that middle and high income customers have with low income residents of the city. So very briefly, this is the methodology. So the survey of utility customers was core here. There was a survey of over 400 customers from 2 utilities, Nawasco and Rujuja. And these were the results. This is an extremely rapid tour of this research, but in terms of the results, we consider these to be encouraging, as did WASREP. So 75% of respondents were willing to pay some amount, an average of 8% of their water bill. The research also produced interesting findings around how this surcharge could be introduced in terms of messaging, also in terms of bill type. So it was clear that proportion of bill was favored by customers as opposed to a flat amount. Trust was found to be critical. There are a whole range of factors that were not found to influence willingness to pay. Corruption, perhaps not surprisingly, was the most cited concern or trust, but there was found to be a level of trust in water utilities, less so in county government, but it's the utilities that would be primarily implementing this surcharge. And in conclusion, 75% of customers willing to pay some amount. If we took the median willingness to pay that was expressed, that would amount to 13 billion Kenyan shillings annually for sanitation improvements in low-income areas, which is significant. Still, clearly, there would be a massive financing gap that would remain, but it would go some way to addressing the deficit. And if this were to be introduced, messaging around trust to allay some of those concerns around corruption would be integral to the way this would be positioned, and positioning this or introducing this as a proportion of the water bill rather than a flat rate would be recommended. And just to end with some very positive news, which we've only heard in the last week. So Nakuru Utility, the board of ESAWAS, have approved the introduction of the surcharge. And there is now the prospect also of trialling this in 2 other utilities. Okay, so we've got 2 examples there around sanitation surcharges in Maputo and in Kenya. So over to you now for questions, and you can direct those to Baggy. We also have Peter and also Kariuki Mugo, my colleague who's country program manager for Kenya, is in the room. So, any questions?
Thank you, Juliet Willits from the University of Technology, Sydney. I just had a question. It said that the surcharge, it would be used for FSM and for wastewater. Got a question, I guess, about containment, and we know that there's lots of poor quality containment, and if or how might funds be used in that direction?
Thank you. So, Peter, can I direct that question to you? So how might surcharge funds be directed towards addressing containment systems? We can take one more question in the meantime.
My question is that in India, when we do a survey in the urban slum settlements, people are more inclined to fixed charges, not proportional charges. They want a fixed charge, and they don't want to pay for variable because of corruption, because of they want it fixed, and because their volume of water usage is also very high. So they want it fixed rather than a stepwise proportional charge. So how does that fix in, did you investigate that in your study? And, and also the quantity of water, if you are looking at, so how much quantity of water a household actually needs, and what is the charge they're willing to pay, whether fixed charge or proportional? Dipinder from India, NIUA.
Okay, thank you. So Peter, can I put that question to you firstly around how revenue generated through the surcharge might be channeled to address sanitation containment?
Can I ask a question before Peter answers? I'm here in the back. Engineer, please wait. Okay. Okay, I'm Barbara Senko from the USAID Water Sanitation and Hygiene Finance Program. And I have 2, I don't know if there are questions or comments. Lusaka Water has been running a sanitation surcharge for like 5, 7 years possibly. So it would be interesting to hear their experience around that particular sanitation surcharge. And why I remembered the Lusaka Water, because there were 2 things that have been troubling me about I like the idea of the surcharge, by the way. But there are 2 problems I have with it. The first one relates to how do you make sure that when this money is collected, it is used for what it is intended for? And at which point, the surcharges tend to be very small. So by the time you accumulate $1 million, it's taken you 3 years, by which time the utility has decided they had a pipe burst somewhere which required immediate attention, and that money went to the pipe burst instead of going into toilets. So how do you address that? Because the money is being held by the water company. The second issue relates to what is coming out of Kenya. Who sets it, the surcharge? A surcharge for me is a tax on the population. Should that be done at the local level, or is that a national, is that a Ministry of Finance function? And if every company in Kenya is going to set a surcharge, there are like 80 companies in Kenya. Who draws the line? Who holds these people accountable?
Thank you. I think I begin with the last one. Who says the surcharge? Yeah? Yes. The way we have in the Kenyan situation, the tariff determination is by the regulator. So that is set by the regulator, but not by each of the company. And it's very clearly, if you look at the legal framework, that responsibility is bestowed on the regulator. The other one has to do with how is this money going to be used. If you look at the entire sanitation value chain, from containment, emptying, and transportation, the area where it is going to be used and where there's the biggest problem is a question is from the emptying and transportation, because most of what is emptied and transported never get to the treatment. That's where it's going to come in. And in the informal areas, the challenge is mostly in those who need to be connected. If you have got to be connected to probably the closest sewer line, then it's going to come in form of subsidy. And the idea behind this is that the individual, plot owners or landowners still must have some responsibility for ownership. But basically, it's meant to make it easier to connect. If you are going to get connected, it is supposed to make sure that it's supposed to make it easier that the environment is not polluted by trying to subsidize in terms of transportation, and also safeguarding the public health. And I want to add to the study that has come here that was done in Kenya, is that previously, before this study, the regulator has done a similar study, and what came out clearly, looking at the financing gap that you need to close on the on sanitation, a 5% surcharge is what was recommended by the regulator. Now, the problem we are having is the use of the name. We've had a workshop in Kenya to try and find out which is the most appropriate name. If you call it a levy, as Dr. Barbara there is raising, it goes to parliament, and it can cause you and cry all over. When we thought we were home and dry and we settled for surcharge, in the Kenyan context, if you tell somebody you are surcharging, they ask you, what have I done for you to surcharge me? So that is not acceptable, and we are not going to pay it. So at the moment, we are thinking of calling it a fee, and that is the direction as a regulator. That's what we are encouraging. Some sort of sanitation fee, because if you just call it that, then that is within the mandate of the regulator when the regulator is doing the tariff. But you bring other terminologies, then you bring other busy bodies, and then you'll never move. But that is within the Kenyan context. Thank you.
We'll come to some of the other questions. Mugo, did you want to? We'll come to you in a moment.
Again, my name is Jackson Tazamba. I come from the Ministry of Water. You can have those surcharges and the tariffs, different tariffs for charging the communities. But the problem which we face, I don't know what is the situation in Kenya, whereby we have these bylaws. Enforcement is a really big problem. In my country, it's a problem. And this morning we were discussing with even Zambia. They talk about it, that is a problem. So I don't know if you have tried to practice that in Kenya and the sea, whether people will be complying and whether you are getting a support from the local authorities or the municipal council, so that at least the enforcement of the law or bylaws are there, and also you be able to correct the tariffs. Because the problem which I came to realize that whenever we have these programs where we are being supported from outside, then it's very easy to run these systems. But now the part of the sustainability part of it becomes a problem when this program finishes. So can we get your experience and see how can we sustain this rather than saying, okay, we have a program because we're aiming at 2030 to have not to leave anyone behind, and we look beyond the 2030. Is this going to be sustainable? And how are we working together with the local authority to make sure that the enforcement of the laws are really supporting the whole situation? Thank you.
So if I understood correctly, the question there is around the sustainability of this mechanism. How can we ensure that it is continued over time? Right. Peter, do you have anything to comment on the sustainability of the surcharge if it's introduced?
One of the reasons why we had this failure in sustainability is that, previously NGOs, CBOs would come and put these facilities, and then the big day would come, the opening, cut the ribbon with the mayor around, and that is it. That was one of the reasons. But in Kenya going forward now, utilities have to take leadership in the service provision in the informal settlement. So the management of all these facilities will have to be under the utility. But what we are saying, if it's an ablution block that has been set up there, that will probably need water, there has got to be that client, relationship between the utility and the operator, that the operator of that ablution block is obliged to be paying some monthly bill if he's using water. And this is the only way you can ensure sustainability. And because the utilities are regulated, then the regulator is keeping an eye to see are things functioning as required. So basically what I'm saying is that if you want to ensure sustainability, all these activities must be anchored in the existing institutional framework in that particular country. But if it's just left hanging, you know what happens. 2-3 years down the line, it's something very unsightly. You don't want to get there. Thank you.
Sorry, I just wanted to, before we continue with this, I'll bring Peter in. I'm just aware that I haven't responded to the gentleman's question around flat rate. So to my knowledge, I'm not sure if the research did address whether the preferred mechanism varied by the amount of water consumed, but I haven't seen that featured in the findings that I've seen. So I don't think there was significant variation if that was investigated. I know that's inadequate. I'm sorry that the researchers couldn't be here. They would be able to give you a response, but I'll be happy to follow up with them. Peter, do you want to give your thoughts there, and then we're going to come? I know there's a question at the back.
No, it's on the surcharge, maybe. Maybe for me, I just want to, I know maybe Lusaka Water might not be here to talk about a surcharge in Zambia. Dr. Babla Nsenkwe, I think, asked this question. I think for Zambia, it has been there since 2007, the surcharge. I just want to mention that. And the way we have done it is in such a way that we have allowed a certain percentage on the water bill. The maximum is 5%, but at the moment, all the commercial utilities that have been allowed, they're using 2.5%. And the way we do it is in such a way that when the money is collected, it's put in a separate account. This is what we call a sanitation account. And it's audited by the regulator on quarterly basis. And every year, the commercial utilities are required to submit the projects that are going to undertake using that sanitation surcharge every year. So we analyze the projects, and once we approve them, then they're going to implement those projects in that particular year. And these are extension projects. We don't want it to be spent so much on software issues, because what we want is people to see the physical things. So most of the times, the software part, the consultations and everything come from the commercial utilities themselves, but the physical infrastructure, the extensions, those, they come from the surcharge. And you can see from 2007, it is not a short period. It has worked well for us, and we ensure that anyone who is able to cover at least above 100% O&M costs, those are the ones that qualify to get that surcharge, because we don't want them to use it for operations. We want somebody who's already covering operations and maintenance costs. So it has been tested, and it has worked. So if you want maybe more discussions around it, we can still discuss, during lunch or dinner. No, thank you very much.
Dinner invitation. Okay. I think we've got two final questions, and then we're going to wrap this up. Please.
I'm Nadia. I have a question related to the tariff, that when we are speaking about tariff, did that also, before that to set up about the tariff, did there is any study about the feasibility of payment by the customers or the people who are in that? Because if the people are very poor and cannot pay for it while they have other priorities or for livelihood and so on, is there any study happened before any implementation that to know how people can willingness to pay or not?
So
it's about willingness to pay, about that feasibility study about the people and how that can be implemented.
In terms of affordability being the primary concern. And so just in terms of the sanitation surcharge research, that was the customer base that was reviewed was stratified, and that was middle and high income utility customers. So the intention would not be to introduce this for lower income households. Was there one more question? No. Okay. I know it's 1 o'clock, but I do want to give the opportunity for some closing remarks, just to send you all away on an inspirational note. So, Kariuki Mugo, if I can come to you first. So Mugo is country program manager for WhatsApp in Kenya. He's been really closely involved in 2 of the initiatives that you've heard about today, the sanitation surcharge and the Pro-Poor KBI. So I wanted to invite Mugo just to share his reflections on this topic.
Good afternoon, everyone. Mine is basically to say that the reason why we worked with WASREP to come up with a specific indicator for low-income customers is because there was a problem with utilities. And there was a very huge drive by donors, by other supporters, by the government to invest in services, to invest in improved services for low-income people. But what we realized that they were not being sustainable, they were not adding any value to commercialization of these companies. And there was a very huge wastage of public and donor resources in improving services that would actually fall out of their management regime. So I think in terms of the impact we have seen with the numbers on how the 10 largest utilities have moved their coverage by 10% within 1 year. So we think that is a very critical achievement. We've also heard about the scalability, how we have moved from 9 utilities. We are moving to cover 10 utilities by this April. And in the next 1 year, we'll move to the next 48 to make all urban utilities that are regulated by WASREP to be accountable to services to low-income people. I think over and above that, we are looking at the tariff, and I would like to respond to what Barbara asked. That is very little money that is going to be raised from the tariff, and how it's going to be utilized. I think if you give $1 million or $10 million to our utilities today in Kenya to invest on on-site sanitation, there's very little impact that is going to be seen. That money will be spent, and you're not going to see any transformation in terms of improved services. So I think the question is not how much we can raise from this tariff. The issue is how are we learning about the mechanisms for investing, for structuring the utilities to be able to invest and sustain that, and also how we're going to ring-fence that in the long term. So we might be collecting very little money with these tariffs or the fees, but I think we are going through a learning process on how to play that game better. Thank you.
So I want to invite the 2 Peters. If you have any aspects of this discussion that maybe you feel hasn't been adequately reflected on today, or if there's a key message with which you'd like to send all of us off to lunch, please share now. So maybe start with Mr. Mutale.
I think for me, it's just to maybe emphasize that we should not live in theories and concepts. If you have concepts and theories and you want to remain with them without applying them, then they will have any meaningful impact. And I think this is the reason why from Zambia, we have a lot of theories, a lot of concepts. Now we are saying, let's move into practice. And I think it should be for all of us to do that. Now, for us to ensure that we don't leave anyone behind in terms of inequalities, service provision, inclusiveness, I think regulation becomes very, very important, because a regulator always takes care of the poor. And this is the reason why we are extending our services to on-site sanitation and rural, so that as a regulator, we ensure that services go to each and every person so that we don't leave anyone behind. So these frameworks that we have developed, I think that they can easily be developed by any other country. I think the procedures and the processes are quite simple. So maybe during lunch or evening, we can still discuss the processes that we went through. It's something that can be implemented also in other countries. Thank you very much.
And finally, Njaga.
Yeah, thank you. I believe under the framework, leaving no one behind, it does not mean that person in your village. It means everybody in the world, because this is where we call home. So all is not lost. There is an ongoing initiative in the region under ESAWAS to develop a framework for sanitary regulation within the 10 member countries. And with that, we want to acknowledge the support we are getting from Bill and Melinda Gates. So gradually, we are making headways. As much as each country has its own initiative going on, we realize we are not there and we need to perform better. So there's that regional, initiative, because do not leave anyone behind, in the whole world. The other thing is that I think as a take-home message that utilities must take leadership and have clear mandate on what they should do in service provision, the informal settlements. As I said earlier, we get failure because these projects are done and then it's not anchored in any institution. And then question of a partnership with CBOs and NGOs, they also feel a very important gap, and that should also probably come on board. And then there must be strategy and clear budget lines for service to the informal settlements. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So thank you all for coming. I hope you've heard about a lot of interesting initiatives. These are at an early stage, and we will certainly follow up. Who knows, perhaps at the next AfricaSan, we'll have a chance to see how they develop. Baggy's making a move for the very last word. It would be cruel of me to deny you. So go on, Baggy.
No, the only last word I'd like to say is that one thing which came through in all these things is that it's a journey that takes time, and we've got to persist with the journey. And it is something that's not going to happen overnight, but really, you climb the hill, as Peter was saying, and you get the next hill, but we will get to the top hill at then. So we have to carry on in this journey to achieve that end. And in many cases, we're starting off at a low baseline. And therefore, we recognize that in order to move that process forward. And of course, ultimately, it's political will that wins the day. Thank you.
Okay, a round of applause for our speakers, please, and thank you for coming.